The lantern didn't just fall, it was pushed. Margaret Sullivan knew it in her bones, even as the smoke clawed at her throat and another contraction ripped through her body. She was pinned in the corner of the cabin, her world shrinking to the rough wood at her back and the hungry wall of flames eating its way toward her. Outside, the Wyoming winter of 1872 was screaming, but the sound inside was worse. The sound of her life, her dreams, turning to ash. Just 3 days ago, she'd buried her husband, Thomas, 40 miles from anyone, with a baby fighting its way into a world determined to kill them both. The fever had taken Thomas, they said, a quick, brutal thing. But as the flames licked over the rocking chair he'd built for their child, Margaret remembered the look in his eyes the day before he fell ill. It wasn't sickness, it was fear. The cabin groaned, a final sigh before death. The roof was about to come down. She had seconds. Better to run through the fire than be crushed beneath it. She gathered her skirts, took one last searing breath of smoke, and braced herself. And that's when a man walked out of the fire. He didn't scream. He didn't burn. He just moved through the inferno like it was a summer mist, his eyes locked on hers. He was tall, Lakota, his face a mask of stone in the flickering light. He carried a thick wool blanket, and the flames seemed to part for him, to bow before him. Was this death? Had her mind finally snapped? He reached her just as her legs gave out. He wrapped the blanket around them both, creating a cocoon of impossible coolness in the heart of the blaze. She felt herself being lifted, carried through the roar and the heat. They burst out into the shocking cold of the night, and he set her down gently in a snowbank. Behind them, the cabin collapsed with a sound like the world ending. Another contraction hit, harder than any before, and a scream tore from her lungs. The Lakota scout knelt beside her. He looked from her swollen belly to the ruins of her home, and then back to her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a strange, knowing light. He spoke, his English accented, the words sending a new kind of chill down her spine. "He came back, didn't he?" he said. "The man who was here last week, the one who argued with your husband. How could he possibly know that? Who was this man who walked through fire? And what did he know about the last days of Thomas Sullivan's life?" The scout didn't wait for an answer. He moved with a quiet purpose that was both terrifying and comforting. He cleared a patch of snow, spread the miraculous, unburnt blanket, and helped Margaret lie down. From a sheath on his belt, he drew a long, gleaming knife. Margaret's heart seized, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. But he only used it to cut strips from his own shirt, his movements precise and practiced. The next hour was a blur of pain and instinct. The stranger never spoke again, but his presence was a steady anchor in the storm of childbirth. He knew exactly what to do, supporting her, offering her snow to cool her lips, his hands gentle but sure. He was a ghost in the firelight, a midwife sent from some other, harder world. And then a cry, not of pain, but of life. A daughter screaming her fury at the cold, cruel world. The scout cut the cord, wrapped the baby in another piece of his shirt, and handed her to Margaret. In the dancing shadows, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth turn up in a smile. Tears streamed down Margaret's soot-stained face as she looked at her child, Thomas's nose, her own stubborn chin. "Grace," she whispered, the name a prayer. A gift of grace in the middle of hell. He nodded as if he understood everything. He built a small, controlled fire nearby, a stark contrast to the inferno that had consumed her home. The warmth was a blessing. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit Margaret like a physical blow. She fought to keep her eyes open, terrified that if she slept, she'd wake up alone. The scout seemed to read her mind. He touched her shoulder lightly. "Rest," he said. "I watch." But before sleep could take her, he knelt by the fire, his gaze distant. "The man I was tracking," he said, his voice low. "He left tracks leading away from here. He has a fresh burn on his left hand, and he smells of lantern oil." He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. "Your husband did not die of a fever, did he?" Margaret's blood ran cold. The argument. A week ago, a man had come to the cabin, a trapper named Prescott. He and Thomas had argued loudly about property lines, about a claim Thomas had filed. Thomas had come back inside, his face pale, and refused to speak of it. 2 days later, he'd fallen ill after a trip to the river. He'd said he fell through the ice, but now, the scout's words planted a seed of pure poison in her mind. He said, "He fell," Margaret whispered, her throat raw. The scout shook his head slowly. "I found him by the river. Not where one would fall through ice. There were other tracks. A struggle." He let the words hang in the freezing air. He wasn't just a random savior who saw smoke. He had been tracking a killer. And the trail had led him here, to this exact spot, on this exact night. It wasn't a coincidence. It was fate. Sleep finally dragged her under, but it was a sleep haunted by questions. Her husband hadn't died. He'd been murdered. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been an attempt to destroy the evidence. And her savior was a hunter, and his prey was the man who had taken everything from her. The world had just become a much more dangerous place, and she and her newborn daughter were standing right in the middle of it. Dawn broke, painting the snow in shades of pink and orange. Margaret awoke to warmth, not the terrifying heat of the fire, but the gentle warmth of furs. The scout had built a lean-to shelter against the wind, using salvaged timbers and pine boughs. A small pot, miraculously intact, simmered over the fire. He sat with his back to her, watching the sun rise. In the morning light, she could see streaks of gray in his long hair. He turned as if sensing her gaze, and his face seemed gentler than it had by firelight. He gestured to the pot. "Drink." The warm broth tasted of pine needles and something wild and earthy. It was life itself. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't even know your name." He was quiet for a long time. "They call me Joseph White Eagle," he said, the name sounding ancient and powerful. He looked at the charred ruins of her home. "Prescott came here looking for something. Do you know what it was?" Margaret shook her head, confused. I don't." Thomas handled the claim papers. He was so excited about this land. He said it was special. "It is," Joseph said, his voice flat. "This land you built on is part of a contested treaty parcel. My people have hunted here for generations. But your husband found something else. Something that made the white man's maps more important." He stirred the fire, the simple action full of unspoken weight. He found color in the creek bed. Gold. The word hung in the air, seeming to change the very quality of the light. Gold. That's what the argument was about. That's why Prescott was so angry. Thomas hadn't just claimed a piece of dirt. He'd stumbled onto a fortune that had gotten him killed. "I have to get to the trading post," Margaret said, a new urgency in her voice. "I have to report this. Tell the sheriff." Joseph gave a bitter, humorless smile. "The trading post is at Elm Creek. 2 days' walk. 3, with the baby. And the sheriff there? He is a friend of Prescott. You will find no justice there. Only more danger." The hope that had flickered in her heart died just as quickly. She was trapped. A widow with a newborn. A secret about gold. And a murderer somewhere out there in the wilderness. A murderer who now knew she was alive. And her only protector was a man whose people had their own claim to the very land her husband had died for. Was he helping her, or was he just after the gold himself? Every path forward seemed to lead to a new kind of death. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph stood up. "There is another place, closer. My winter camp, a hidden valley. You will be safe there, for now." Safety. The word was a foreign country, but what choice did she have? Trust the silent Lakota man who seemed to be one step ahead of a killer, or risk the 2-day journey to a town where the law was on the side of the man who wanted her dead? "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "Why are you helping me?" He looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "My wife and son died in the winter sickness 3 years ago," he said, the words sparse but carrying an ocean of grief. "The spirits work in circles. A life is taken, a life is given. Today I will honor the circle." He turned and began packing their few salvaged belongings. "We leave when you are ready. Prescott will come back. He knows you survived the fire, and he knows you are the only other person who knows his secret." He wasn't wrong. Prescott wouldn't just let her go. He'd hunt her down to silence her. The wilderness was no longer a neutral backdrop. It was a hunting ground, and she was the prey. Joseph offered a sanctuary, but it meant going deeper into the wild, further from her own world, and putting her life and her daughter's life completely into the hands of a stranger whose motives were still a mystery. It wasn't a choice. It was a leap of faith into the heart of the storm. They walked for hours, Joseph breaking a trail through the deceptively soft snow. He had fashioned a sling for Grace, and the baby rode snug against Margaret's chest, lulled to sleep by the rhythm of their movement. The world was a canvas of white and blue, beautiful and deadly. Joseph moved with a silent, fluid grace, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the land like a book Margaret couldn't even begin to comprehend. Suddenly he stopped, holding up a hand for silence. Margaret froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the distance, carried on the crisp air, were voices, English voices. Joseph pulled her behind a rocky outcropping, his movements swift and sure. He peered through a gap in the rocks, his body tense. Margaret risked a look. 3 men on horseback, heavily armed, their faces hard and grim. "Tracks lead this way," one of them said, his voice grating. "Saw the smoke 2 nights back. Porter said he saw a Lakota moving through here yesterday." And then Margaret's blood turned to ice. The man who spoke was Jake Prescott. His left hand was wrapped in a dirty bandage. It was him, the murderer, and he had brought friends. Joseph's hand went to the knife at his belt. His expression was like granite. Margaret knew he was weighing the odds. 1 man, even one as capable as Joseph, against 3 with rifles. It was suicide. Grace chose that moment to stir, making a small, fussy sound. Margaret pressed the baby closer, trying to shush her, but it was too late. "Hear that?" another rider said, perking up. Sounded like a baby. Prescott's eyes narrowed, scanning the landscape. His gaze swept over their hiding place. For a heart-stopping second, Margaret thought he'd seen them. "Spread out," he ordered. "He's got the woman with him. Find them. The woman is mine. The Indian. You can have him." The men dismounted, spreading out in a search pattern that would inevitably find them. There was nowhere to run. They were cornered. Joseph made a decision. He looked at Margaret, his eyes conveying a silent, urgent command. He pointed to a narrow ravine behind them. "Run. Hide. Don't stop." He was going to face them alone. Create a diversion. Sacrifice himself to buy her time. Margaret shook her head, grabbing his arm, a silent plea. But he just squeezed her shoulder once, a gesture of finality, and then he stepped out from behind the rocks. "Looking for me?" he called out, his voice calm and steady. The 3 men spun around, rifles instantly at their shoulders. "Well, well," Prescott sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "White Eagle, should have known you'd be sniffing around. The land belongs to my employer now, all of it, and we're clearing out the squatters, both kinds." His employer. This wasn't just about a small gold claim. This was bigger. "The woman," Joseph said, his hands held open to show he was unarmed. "Let her go. Your business is with me." "Oh, I'll get to you," Prescott said. "But the woman, she's a loose end. And my boss, Mr. Corbin, he doesn't like loose ends." He raised his rifle, aiming not at Joseph, but at the rocks where Margaret was hiding. "Come on out, Mrs. Sullivan, or your red-skinned savior gets a belly full of lead." It was a trap. There was no escape. Joseph had walked right into it to save her, and now they were both going to die. Margaret's mind raced. She looked at the ravine behind her. She could try to run, but they'd shoot Joseph down in a second. She looked at Grace, her innocent daughter, her whole life ahead of her. And then she remembered the revolver. Thomas had insisted she learn to use it. It was in the small pack of salvaged items Joseph was carrying. A desperate, impossible idea took root. As Prescott's finger tightened on the trigger, Joseph did something unexpected. He began to sing, a low, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate in the very air. A Lakota death song. It was a warrior's defiance, a final act of courage. The sound was unnerving. It distracted the men for a fraction of a second. But a fraction was all Joseph needed. With a speed that defied belief, he lunged, not at Prescott, but at the horse closest to him. In one fluid motion, he vaulted into the saddle, dug his heels into the animal's flanks, and charged directly at the other two men. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed and reared. The two men, caught off guard, scrambled to control their mounts. Joseph, now on horseback, was a different kind of threat. He was a whirlwind of motion, a blur of righteous fury. Prescott, however, stayed focused. He ignored the chaos and kept his rifle trained on the rocks. "It's over, Margaret," he yelled. "There's nowhere left to run." He was right, but she wasn't running. Joseph's charge had given her the opening she needed. While all eyes were on him, she'd slipped the revolver from his pack. Now she rose from behind the rock, the heavy gun surprisingly steady in her two hands, and aimed it straight at Jake Prescott's chest. "Get away from him," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Prescott's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed into a venomous glare. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You think you can shoot me, little lady? You don't have the stomach for it." He was probably right. The thought of taking a life, even his, was sickening. But then she looked at Grace, bundled against her chest, and she saw Thomas's face, pale with a fever that wasn't a fever at all, and something inside her hardened into steel. "This isn't for me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, cold whisper. "It's for my husband." At that moment, Joseph, having scattered the other two men, wheeled his stolen horse around and charged back toward Prescott. Prescott was caught between two threats. He had to make a choice. He swung his rifle toward the charging Lakota warrior. It was the last mistake he ever made. Margaret fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the winter silence. Prescott jerked backward, a look of utter astonishment on his face, before collapsing into the snow. The other two men, seeing their leader fall, didn't hesitate. They spurred their horses and fled, disappearing into the trees like frightened deer. Silence descended. The only sounds were the panting of the horse and Margaret's own ragged breathing. Joseph slid from the horse's back and walked toward her. He looked at Prescott's body, then at the revolver still smoking in her hand. He gently took the gun from her, his touch steadying her trembling fingers. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw something other than stoic resolve. She saw respect. "You are stronger than you know, Margaret Sullivan," he said softly. But the moment was shattered by a new sound, a low groan. Prescott wasn't dead. He was trying to push himself up, clutching a bloody wound in his shoulder. His face was a mask of pain and pure, unadulterated hatred. "This isn't over," he gasped, his eyes locking on Margaret. "Corbin, he'll send more men. He'll burn the whole mountain down to get what he wants. You have no idea who you're dealing with." He collapsed back into the snow, unconscious. Corbin. The name hung in the air, a promise of a greater threat to come. They hadn't ended the danger. They had just escalated it. They had won the battle, but in doing so, they may have just started a war. And now they had a witness who knew their faces and where they were headed. The hidden valley was no longer a secret sanctuary. It was a target. Joseph wasted no time. He bound the still unconscious Prescott, securing him tightly. "We cannot kill a wounded man," he stated, his voice flat, "but we cannot leave him here. He will go with us." The thought of bringing the man who murdered her husband into their sanctuary was horrifying, but Margaret understood the cold logic. Leaving him meant he could be found by his allies. Taking him meant they controlled the information. He was no longer just a threat. He was a prisoner. The journey to the valley was tense and grim. Prescott woke halfway through, groaning and cursing, his eyes burning with a hateful fire. He was weak, but his threats were strong. "Corbin owns this territory," he spat, blood flecking his lips. "The judges, the marshals, they're all in his pocket. You think you can hide? There's no place on God's green earth he won't find you." Joseph ignored him, his focus on the trail ahead. He led them through a narrow pass, so cleverly hidden in the rock face that Margaret would have walked by it 100 times without ever noticing. The path opened into a breathtaking sight, a small valley perfectly cradled by high ridges, a stream meandering through its center. It was a paradise, untouched and serene. At the far end, built against a cliff, was a small, sturdy lodge, part log cabin, part traditional Lakota dwelling. It was a place of peace, but the presence of Prescott felt like a desecration. Inside, the lodge was surprisingly civilized. There were shelves with books, maps on the wall, and a great stone fireplace. It was the home of a man who lived between two worlds. Joseph tended to Prescott's wound with a detached efficiency, cleaning and binding it with herbs that made the man hiss in pain. Then he secured him to a support beam in the corner of the room. "Now," Joseph said, turning to Margaret, "we have an answer to our questions." The interrogation was brutal in its simplicity. Joseph asked quiet, direct questions. Prescott, fueled by pain and arrogance, answered with boasts and threats, inadvertently revealing the scope of their enemy. Corbin wasn't just a rancher. He was a railroad baron, buying up land for a new spur line. But he wasn't just buying. He was using men like Prescott to scare off, or eliminate, anyone who wouldn't sell. Thomas's claim, with its gold discovery, was a complication Corbin wouldn't tolerate. It wasn't just in the way of the railroad. It was a treasure he wanted for himself. "He has a map," Prescott finally snarled, a feverish glint in his eye. "An old Spanish map that shows a whole vein of gold running through this mountain. Your husband's little discovery was just the tip. Corbin wants it all, and that map shows a second entrance to this very valley. He'll find you. It's only a matter of time." A second entrance. The one secret Joseph thought was his own. The sanctuary was already breached. As if on cue, a sound echoed from outside. A rifle shot, distant but unmistakable. Not a warning, a signal. Joseph's face became a mask of cold fury. He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. After a long moment, he turned back, his eyes grim. "It's Marcus," he said. "Marcus Freeman, a trapper. He is my friend." That was his signal. It means trouble has followed us. They didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, a bear of a man with a thick beard and kind eyes appeared at the edge of the trees, accompanied by a graceful Cheyenne woman. This was Marcus and his wife, Sarah. But they weren't alone. They were leading a group of people, 3 other families, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, their children clinging to their sides. "Joseph," Marcus said as he entered the lodge, his eyes falling on the bound Prescott with a grim understanding. "Corbin's men are sweeping the territory. They're clearing everyone out, burned our trapping cabin, the Jensen's homestead too. We're all that's left. We came here hoping you could hide us." The hidden valley had become a refugee camp. The weight of their survival now rested on Joseph and Margaret. But as Sarah, whose eyes held the wisdom of a healer, looked at Margaret, she said something that changed everything. "The soldiers are with them," Sarah said softly. "A whole cavalry patrol, led by a Sergeant McVeigh. They're not just helping Corbin, they're using an old treaty violation as an excuse. They say your husband's claim was illegal, that this entire mountain is government land, to be turned over to the railroad for progress." It was a conspiracy, larger and more insidious than Margaret could have imagined. They weren't just fighting a greedy baron. They were fighting the United States government itself. Their personal tragedy was a footnote in a sweeping, violent story of expansion and greed. Prescott laughed from his corner, a raw, ragged sound. "See? I told you. There's nowhere to run." Suddenly, the world outside the lodge erupted in a fusillade of gunfire. Bullets tore through the wooden walls. The children screamed. The siege had begun. They were pinned down, a handful of families against a private army in the U.S. cavalry. "There is one way out," Joseph said, his voice cutting through the chaos. He pointed to a large bearskin rug on the floor. "The valley has another secret. Not an entrance, an exit." Under the rug was a trap door. The tunnel was ancient, hand-dug, reinforced with timbers that were centuries old. It smelled of damp earth and time. Joseph led the way with a single lantern, guiding the refugees, the Freemans, the Jensens, and the others, into the darkness. Margaret followed, carrying Grace, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a strange, fierce hope. Prescott, gagged and bound, was hauled along by Marcus, their unwilling key to whatever came next. The tunnel twisted and turned, sloping steadily downwards. It follows an underground river, Joseph explained, his voice echoing in the close confines. It will take us to the far side of the mountain. They'll be waiting for us at the main pass, but they don't know about this. Where does it lead? Marcus asked, his voice strained from the effort of dragging their prisoner. To a place of judgment, Joseph said, his words cryptic and heavy. The cave of whispering wind. My ancestors held councils there. They say the spirits of the mountain listen in that place. After what felt like an eternity, the air changed. A cool draft whispered against their faces. They emerged not into the open, but into a vast cavern, so large the lantern light barely touched the far walls. In the center of the cavern, a single shaft of moonlight lanced down from an opening high above, illuminating a flat, altar-like rock. The place had power. Margaret could feel it, a low thrum of energy in the stone beneath her feet. We rest here, Joseph announced. Then we decide what comes next. As the family settled, exhausted and terrified, Sarah came to Margaret's side. She looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest. A child born in fire, she murmured. She is a sign. The old ways are not dead. They are just waiting for the right heart to be reborn into. While they rested, Joseph and Marcus interrogated Prescott again, away from the children. This time stripped of his arrogance and facing the grim reality of his situation. The man broke. He told them everything. Corbin's plan wasn't just to take the land. It was to start a conflict. He wanted an Indian uprising. A massacre would void the old treaties for good and give him clear title to the entire region and its mineral rights. The patrol wasn't there to enforce the law. They were there to be the spark that lit the fire. Sergeant McVeigh was on Corbin's payroll, waiting for an excuse to open fire on any native group he found. He's sending riders to the reservation, Prescott choked out, telling them you've kidnapped a white woman, trying to lure the warriors out. He wants a war, and he's going to get it. The trap wasn't just for them. It was for Joseph's entire people. Their personal fight for survival had become the flashpoint for a potential genocide. They were out of time. They had to get word to the Lakota, warn them not to fall for Corbin's deadly provocation. But how? The mountain was surrounded. Then Joseph looked at the beam of moonlight in the center of the cave. A desperate, impossible plan began to form in his mind. The spirits of the mountain, he whispered. They do not just listen, they can also speak. He pointed up at the hole in the ceiling. That is not just a hole, it is a chimney. The mountain breathes through it, and a smoke signal from that chimney can be seen for 100 miles. It was a crazy risk. A signal would not only alert his people, but it would also pinpoint their exact location for Corbin and the soldiers. They would be bringing the entire weight of their enemies down on this one sacred spot. It is a choice, Joseph said, looking around at the frightened faces huddled in the cavern. To die hiding in the dark, or to make our stand in a place of power. To fight for our own lives, or to fight for the lives of all our people. Margaret looked down at her daughter, Grace. What future would she have in a world where men like Corbin could manufacture wars for profit? The choice was clear. Light the fire, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. They weren't just refugees anymore. They were rebels, and this sacred cave was about to become the heart of the resistance. They prepared for a final stand. The men, armed with a few rifles and their hunting knives, fortified the entrance to the cave. The women tended to the children, their quiet courage a force in itself. Margaret, who just weeks ago was a simple homesteader's wife, found herself tearing strips of cloth for bandages, her mind clear and focused. She was a mother protecting her child, a widow avenging her husband, and a woman who had finally found her own strength in the heart of the fire. Joseph, meanwhile, prepared the great fire in the center of the cavern. He used a special combination of damp leaves and dry wood, a technique passed down through generations, to create a thick, oily smoke that would carry for miles. As he worked, he chanted, his voice echoing off the ancient walls, a prayer to the spirits of the mountain for strength and protection. As the first tendrils of smoke began to curl up towards the opening in the ceiling, a new sound reached them from the tunnel, shouting, gunfire. "They've found the tunnel!" Marcus yelled. "They're coming!" The battle for the cave of whispering wind had begun. Corbin's men poured into the tunnel, but the narrow passage became a death trap. The refugees, fighting with the ferocity of cornered animals, held them back. The cavern filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the terrible sounds of combat. Above, the smoke signal billowed into the night sky, a desperate plea written against the stars. But would it be seen? And if it was, who would answer first? The Lakota warriors or Sergeant McVeigh's cavalry? Hours passed in a blur of terror and adrenaline. They held the tunnel, but their ammunition was running low. The attackers were relentless. Margaret, hiding with the other women and children in a side chamber, held Grace tight, singing her a lullaby to drown out the sounds of the fight. Then a new sound, a war cry, high and piercing, echoing from the world outside. It was answered by another and another. The Lakota had seen the signal. They had come. But a moment later, another sound joined the chorus, the clear, sharp notes of a cavalry bugle. Everyone had answered the call. All the players in Corbin's deadly game were now converging on this one spot. The final battle was not going to be in the tunnel. It was going to be on the mountainside, in the moonlight. The gunfire from the tunnel entrance stopped. A tense silence fell over the cave. Joseph, Marcus, and the other men peered cautiously down the passage. It was empty. The attackers had retreated. "They're pulling back," Marcus whispered, confused. "Why?" "Because the main event is about to begin," Joseph said, his face grim. "Come." He led them to a hidden ledge near the cave's main entrance, overlooking the mountainside. The scene below was breathtaking and horrifying. 100 Lakota warriors on horseback were arrayed at the edge of the forest, a silent, disciplined force. Opposite them, a line of blue-coated cavalry, rifles at the ready. Between them stood a single, portly man in civilian clothes, gesturing wildly. Corbin. And beside him, Sergeant McVeigh. They were trapped between two armies on the verge of a massacre that would stain the pages of history. "This is what Corbin wanted," Margaret breathed, seeing the whole terrible plan laid bare. "He'll have the soldiers fire on the warriors. The warriors will retaliate. It will be a slaughter, and he'll get his land." But Joseph was looking past the two armies, at a third group of riders approaching from the south. A smaller group, but one that carried an unexpected authority. Leading them was a man Margaret recognized with a jolt of shock. James Mitchell, the powerful rancher who had helped her in town. And beside him rode the territorial marshal. "Looks like our little fire sent up more smoke than Corbin was counting on," Marcus said with a grim smile. Mitchell and the marshal rode directly into the space between the two armed forces, a suicidal act of bravery. "Stand down, Sergeant," the marshal's voice boomed across the clearing. "In the name of the law." "I have my orders, Marshal," McVeigh shouted back, his face a mask of fury. "These hostiles are off the reservation." "They're on treaty land," a new voice called out. "Joseph." He stepped out onto the ledge, in full view of everyone. "And you, McVeigh, are trespassing. You are an agent of a criminal, not the law." Corbin spun around, his face purple with rage. "Arrest that man. He's a renegade, a kidnapper." "Am I?" Joseph called out. And then he did something no one expected. He began to speak in Lakota, his voice rolling down the mountainside, powerful and clear. He was not calling for war. He was telling the story of the fire, of Thomas Sullivan's murder, of the families driven from their homes. As he spoke, Margaret stepped out beside him, holding Grace. Her presence was a powerful, undeniable testament to the truth of his words. This was no captive. This was a survivor, a witness. "I have a prisoner," Joseph finished, switching back to English. "A man who will testify that Elias Corbin hired him to murder a homesteader and that Sergeant McVeigh is on his payroll to provoke a war." Marcus and the other men dragged the whimpering Prescott out onto the ledge for all to see. The standoff was absolute. The Lakota warriors, hearing the truth, held their position, their discipline unbreakable. The soldiers, hearing the accusations against their sergeant, began to murmur amongst themselves, their certainty wavering. The marshal, a man who clearly valued true justice over politics, made his decision. "Sergeant McVeigh," he declared, "you and your men are to stand down. You are under investigation for conspiracy. Mr. Corbin, You are under arrest for murder and inciting a riot." Corbin sputtered, his face a mask of disbelief. "You can't do this. I have friends in Washington." "Then you'll need them," the marshal said coldly. "Take them." As the marshal's deputies moved in, McVeigh made a last desperate move. He drew his pistol and fired, not at the marshal, but at Joseph. Margaret screamed, but Joseph was already moving. He dove to the side, the bullet striking sparks on the rock where he had been standing. Before McVeigh could fire again, a single shot rang out from the line of Lakota warriors. The sergeant crumpled to the ground. The spell was broken. Corbin's plan had failed. The war he had tried so desperately to start had been averted by the truth. In the aftermath, the story came out. Prescott, facing the gallows, confessed to everything. The conspiracy was exposed, reaching all the way to a corrupt senator in Washington. Corbin's empire crumbled. The Lakota were hailed not as hostiles, but as a disciplined peacekeeping force. The families driven from their homes were given new land, their claims secured by the territorial government, eager to distance itself from the scandal. And what of Margaret, Joseph, and Grace? They were offered a choice. Margaret could return to the world of the whites, a wealthy widow, as the full extent of the gold vein on her claim was revealed. Joseph could return to his people, a hero who had averted a war. But they had already made their choice. They stood on the mountain looking down at the valley that had been their sanctuary. It was more than just a piece of land now. It was a symbol. "The world isn't ready for a place like this," Mitchell told them, his respect for them clear in his eyes. "But maybe it needs one." He was right. Using the newfound wealth from the gold claim, Margaret and Joseph did something extraordinary. They bought the entire valley not for themselves but for a new kind of community. They established a school, a place where children of all backgrounds, white, Lakota, mixed heritage, could learn together. A place where two cultures could meet not in conflict but in cooperation. The Sullivan White Eagle School became a legend on the frontier. A place where the children learned to read Shakespeare and Lakota star charts, to practice algebra and traditional medicine. It was a bridge between worlds, built by a woman who was born in fire, a man who walked between worlds, and a daughter who was destined to belong to both. Years later, an old Margaret would sit on the porch of the main schoolhouse, watching her daughter Grace, now a grown woman, a teacher herself, tell stories to a new generation of children. They had not chosen the easy path, but they had built something that would last, something worthy. Their story became a quiet legend, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, in the heart of the most brutal conflicts, courage, truth, and an unlikely alliance can change the world. It proves that family isn't just about the blood you share, but about the people you stand with when the world tries to tear you apart. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, make sure you're subscribed, because the tales we have coming up are just as incredible. And a question for the comments. What do you think is the true meaning of sanctuary? Let us know below. Thanks for watching.